certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
A key forensic witness today told court it's impossible to know one way or the other if Jane Rimmer or Ciara Glennon were sexually assaulted. Hello, this is Claremont in Conversation, day 38, with Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clarke and Alison Fan. So I guess what you heard today was that it's impossible to read anything into this particular evidence.
Well, the defence did try with Martin Blooms, who's a very, very experienced veteran forensic scientist, and he is a very, very methodical, meticulous person too. And even though the defence kept pushing the fact that back then in 96 and 97 they weren't the procedures that they are in place today, Martin Bloom said, look, I am a scientist. He's precise in that way. I'm also come from a microbiology background. So I was aware of any cross-contamination and how things had to be done a certain way because of his background and because he is a scientist. So even though the defence kept pushing about this, what could have been done, maybe things were, he managed to get something out today, and that was a couple of specimens from the rape victim, which is crucial, of course, to this case, could have been mislabelled. There were no labels on two particular samples that were taken from intimate parts of her body. And that was how we finished today's proceedings, that these labels were missing. They weren't there. He got questioned very closely. Could they have been there and taken off? But that's how we ended today, because it's been a very, very for someone like me, a commercial TV reporter, I'm finding it very, very hard going, very, very slow. I mean, as you know, we've got a concentration span of, 1 minute? So I'm finding this terribly, terribly difficult. Tim, on the other hand, who's got to write columns and columns of copy, is writing it all down, but I'm finding it very, very hard going. And we are hearing, not from one scientist, I think they've dragged out every forensic scientist and pathologist who's ever been in the Path Centre to give evidence about how careful they've been.
So, Tim, would you be able to talk us through Martin Bloom's evidence today and I guess where he started, which was with the intimate samples from the Karrakatta rape victim?
Yes, so as Ali said, super experienced. I mean, he'd had long experience even before he joined Path West, and then spent the last 18 years of his career there, which obviously spanned the total time that we're talking about, pretty much up until 2012. And in 95, he was the scientist who was tasked with doing the initial tests on the intimate swabs from the Karrakatta victim, which he said all but one or two of them showed up as potentially positive for semen, and so they were then sent off down to the DNA lab, and that's what we heard last week, that they came back, that they did come back, and that was this sample, this extract, that then sat in a box on a shelf at Path West for many, many years without an owner, really, or without knowing whose DNA it was. But we now do know whose DNA it was, and that's Bradley Robert Edwards. So it was Mr. Blooms that actually started that whole process in that lab, hence why he's being called as a witness, and hence why he's being questioned and cross-examined so closely, because at the very start of this process, right to the very end, we need to know everyone who's possibly had contact with these samples. And then and then as you say, in 96 and then 97, he was also involved in testing on exhibits and samples from both Jane and Ciara. So he's one of the only scientists, I guess, that was involved, physically involved in all three of those women.
And was he asked about just how much they knew about cross-contamination back then in 95 and 96 when he was handling these samples?
Yeah, he certainly was, and he was probably one of the most
advanced, yes.
Staunch witnesses. I was going to say, Ali. Actually, one of them. He was very, very vocal in some of his answers about, yeah, well, of course we knew. We were intimately involved in this, and we definitely knew the possibility of contamination and infection of ourselves and others, and he was, really vocal in saying, yeah, we knew, and as far as our processes went, back in the day, they were as solid as they possibly could be, and even sort of went on the front foot and said, I reject and go against any suggestion that we were taking shortcuts, particularly in cleanliness.
And he said because of his microbiology background and the fact that he was also very keen on research, he researched everything. He said as a scientist, we try to find out what's happening, we want to find out more. So he was very, very proactive about any new developments to do with DNA or cross-contamination. Although it was still all in its infancy back then, he was still way ahead of the pack as far as trying to find out what the latest was, and hence he said he was super, super careful and doing things that weren't regulatory, but he did them anyway with protective gloves and so forth. And this is where I think towards the end with the labelling, which we only heard about, it was a short day today. We only sat for the afternoon because the court was used for a welcoming ceremony for judges this morning, so we only got a few hours in today. And just as he ended, we were talking about the labelling, but he was very, very measured and methodical with his answers, straightforward. He said, look, I'm just trying to absolutely get everything correct here. And he's been retired for some time, but he's handled thousands of cases like this. And he said each one is taking great care with the recording. We're told we're about to see 1 million documents. I feel as if we've already seen 1 million documents because we've just seen running sheets, recording sheets, data sheets. It is quite brain numbing by the end of the day, but he has recorded everything quite faithfully, and he's trying to identify writing and initials, and he said, well, they're people who I think are going to hear from further about why this has got no label on it and why this one has got a mislabel on it, that sort of thing.
And was he even in depth in terms of, when he's drying samples and what room they go into? And is there any chance in that room that, DNA could be sort of, almost leaping from one place to another?
Yeah, well, that was one of the main bulks of the questioning today, was about what happened to samples and swabs once they were dealt with or once they'd had that initial process done to them. And he explained that because they were using sterile water to extract biological material off so they could be run, then the initial swabs were also then left a little bit wet, and so he explained how they would then be, the tops of the tubes just would be left open a tiny little bit, and then they would be placed into an oven, not the oven in the mess hall, but a specific drying oven that was used to dry exhibits. And he was asked, well, were they all sort of just shoved in there together? He said no, they were kept in batches in specific cases, but different cases would be in the oven at the same time. And then he was asked, well, would there be any possibility that there could be any contamination through that process, that open tubes being placed in an oven could possibly contaminate each other? And he said, I can't think of any mechanism that would possibly happen, and that DNA just doesn't just leap out of a jar or a pot or a tube on its own and start flying about inside. So he was quite strong. He was quite, as I say, quite verbose in the way he answered, but he was also quite clear in the way he answered, and also quite strong on the processes and methods that Pathwest used even back then.
We heard in a previous podcast from Dr. Cook, who said that there was nothing to suggest that Jane Rimmer or Ciara Glennon had been sexually assaulted. Did Martin Bloom's evidence differ from that today in a subtle way?
Well, we haven't really gone into. We were going through Jane Rimmer. Dr. Cook said that, but he said it couldn't be ruled out because of the state of the bodies. There was no evidence, but he said it still couldn't be ruled out because the decomposure of the bodies was instrumental in him not being able to say one way or the other. We were getting into the DNA with Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. We're getting into an area there where we have got problems talking about some of that, intimate parts. But Tim, you can carry on with that.
Yeah, well, so as I mentioned at the top, Mr. Blooms, because of his seniority and because of his experience, he was obviously tasked with doing a lot of these bigger cases, and Jane and samples from both Jane and Ciara did come across his desk and then his bench, and he was involved in the sampling of those, and he was asked specifically whether the intimate swabs had shown any other bodily fluids other than from Jane or Ciara, and he said no. And then he was specifically asked by Mr. Hollingsworth, who was the prosecutor doing the questioning today, whether that meant, or whether that could say definitively one way or the other, whether those bodily fluids had ever been on those, on both Jane and Ciara. And he said definitely couldn't say one way or the other because of decomposition, and particularly in Jane's case, because we know her body had been left open to the elements for 55 days until she was discovered. And Mr. Blooms was once again quite solid in saying, we know that decomposition means that bodily fluids, either your own or from someone else, will degrade, and therefore just because they weren't there when that test was run doesn't mean they were never there. We just can't say one way or the other.
Well, as we know, it is quite an important question. So we contacted our DNA expert, Brendan Chapman, about that, just to get some clarity on the lifespan of sperm. And he told us that there's no research to guide us on how long sperm or semen will persist in a decomposing body. Obviously, it's hard to study. He's found one unsubstantiated reference suggesting 1 to 2 weeks, but it's anecdotal. In living individuals, there are reports of detected semen or sperm cells up to about a week after the assault, but it's rare, with a significant decline in ability to detect after about 48 hours. So that really does tell us that we really, cannot read anything into these results that are coming back as a negative result.
Yeah, and it was interesting, Mr. Blooms actually gave some evidence about that himself today in terms of when they are testing for those bodily fluids. There's a specific test that they do under the microscope that looks at the amount of whole sperm cells compared to just the heads, and apparently the more whole sperm cells there are, the more likely it was that deposit was left recently, and so obviously there is a way to tell even by eye how long that deposit has been there, in terms of the ratio between heads and whole sperm cells, and what Brendan's very kindly sent us there out of hours would sort of concur with what Mr. Bloom said today, that there is absolutely no doubt in his mind that the amount of time that the bodies were left to the elements would have had an impact on any deposits left there.
And was Martin Blooms asked about the risks of secondary transfer, which is what we discussed in length yesterday in the podcast?
Yeah, in general terms he was, and his awareness of it. And once again, like Ali said earlier, he was very aware even back then, and obviously took some pride in knowing the latest advances in technology, even back in 1997. But I've got a feeling we'll get to a bit more of that tomorrow, as well as this labelling issue. And I think there'll be one other issue concerning Jane that Mr. Blooms might be pinned down on by Mr. Yovich as well. Maybe we'll go back to that in a little while.
And you both mentioned the labelling issue, which was discussed in court today. So Tell us a bit more about that. What was the mix-up or the confusion with the labelling of the samples?
Well, that came towards the very end of today's hearing, which I said was a short hearing, and it seemed that Paul Jovich wanted to finish on that. We finished a little bit early. Normally they'll let it go through to the next thing, but he wanted to start afresh tomorrow morning. And this was where we were shown two documents which referred to a urine sample and another sample taken, an intimate sample taken from the Karrakatta rape victim that had no label on the little containers, and it was documented twice. And he was asked, well, was this your handwriting, or whose initials were this? And he said he was sure that he thought there were other technicians or somebody had handled it, and no doubt we will hear from that more tomorrow, because the urine sample and the other one had no label written, and the other one had and it wasn't a missing label. He got quite intense on that, didn't he, Tim?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. And as I say, he had been quite strong all day on practices and procedures. And when that was brought up with him, I think I got the impression it took him a little bit by surprise, and he was a little bit flummoxed by it. But I mean, given the length of time that has passed, as we've mentioned so many times. So yeah, I get a feeling we'll return to that quite quickly in the morning.
Given the detail of this forensic evidence, is the courtroom as busy as what it was in the past?
Not so much so.
Not as much, no.
Parents are there. Bradley Edwards' parents are there every day. There weren't very many people sitting around them. Ciara Glennon's father, Dennis, is there every day. And apart from that, it's dwindling a little bit. I think because of the nature of the evidence that's been given. Obviously, when live witnesses are there talking, it's quite different from this meticulous, methodical. I really think that anyone who wants to be a forensic pathologist or student should be in there taking notes of what to do and what not to do, because they are covering absolutely every step-by-step aspect of forensic pathology.
And
as we discussed with Shane, Brennan and Damien yesterday, it is hard. It is hard to concentrate on very scientific, very detailed, very specialist sort of areas. I think Ali's right there. I mean, the general public that have been attending has dwindled a little bit, but that's not to say that there's still not a decent crowd in there, because there is, along with all the police officers and other court staff. It's still a pretty full courtroom every day.
Yeah, and as you mentioned yesterday, Tim, the West Australian Police Commissioner also attended court yesterday, which was a very unexpected guest. Did you find that surprising, Ali?
I found it totally astonishing. It's something, if a jury is present, it would be almost grounds for objections, because our courts are always seen to be, there's a separation of powers of the judiciary, the legislative, the executive. I'm sure the judge would have been a bit astonished to see him come in, because he came in during evidence was given. It was testimony be given in the witness box, and he came in, mind you, he wasn't wearing his uniform. So he slipped in, but then he shook hands with Dennis Glennon, and he went to the next row up and shook hands with all the police officers, which I found quite curious to come into a trial. Now, he did state afterwards that he was there to G up the boys and to support the prosecution, which, again, is in a trial where you meant to, the prosecution is meant to just present the facts. It just, to me, very curious and astonishing that a police commissioner would come down there and in open court show this display of, I don't know, what was just very, very odd.
I guess, though, it is his team and their case in terms of the officers that are giving evidence and what have you.
He said he was doing it to just thank them, but I thought to wait. Why wouldn't you wait for the break? Why would you come in while evidence is being given? And I understand that he did play a part in this when he was an assistant deputy commissioner, that he was playing a part in the DNA thing. But he only stayed about 10, 15 minutes. It was just something I found very unusual over the years. I remember during other trials when, like Premier Brian Burke came down, that was just headlines every day that he'd come down. And, of course, this is a trial without a jury, so it's different rules. But I don't know whether the judge would have been happy about someone with such a high profile coming in to his trial.
And you mentioned yesterday, Tim, it was quite an ironic day for the Commissioner to be there because he did actually, he was the person who took carriage of this sample and had it sent to the UK for testing, which was the breakthrough. Yeah,
indeed. And I mean, I take Ali's point that, I mean, he is obviously the police commissioner of any state. He's going to be a high-profile individual. He's been around law enforcement many years. He's got federal experience as well as vast state experience. I didn't find it as unusual as Ali did. I mean, it was definitely a talking point yesterday, no doubt about that. And Ali's absolutely right. If there had been a jury there, it would have been seen in a completely different way.
Be interesting to see what a defence lawyer thinks of it.
Yeah, it would be. Well, I'd be very interested to be inside Mr. Yovis's brain at any point in this trial because we'd be getting a lot more serious than we are at the moment. But yeah, and once again, he's an individual, taxpayer of Western Australia. He's allowed to be in court as anyone else is. But yeah, it was certainly a talking point.
Well, as you mentioned, it was a short day today. Do you know what's in store tomorrow?
Yeah, so Mr. Blooms is back on the stand in the morning. Mr. Jovich warned us all, at least he's got a fair way to go with his cross-examination. And one of the things I think that might be raised with him, during his opening, Mr. Jovich pointed to these incidents of contamination over the journey in Path West, not the specific one that he would love to be able to prove, but other ones involved in this case. And one of those was one of the intimate samples taken from Miss Rimmer, which was later, very much later, in 2017. It was tested by a UK lab called Cellmark, and that popped up a male DNA profile, but not the one they were looking for. It was one of the ones of a male scientist at Path West. And so now we know that it was Mr. Blooms who was involved right at the start of the processing of these samples. I am pretty sure that he will be asked about that tomorrow, given that he was one of the male scientists that worked on it right at the start of the process. And then that will then feed into Mr. Jovich's hopeful narrative of a lab that wasn't as professional as it possibly could have been, which, as Ali mentioned earlier, this mislabeling and
no labelling. There was just a bit of
labeling.
There was just a bit of change of tempo towards the end, enough that as your mind's drifting and you're daydreaming, you sort of instinctively pick up your pen when you hear his tone change a little bit. And that was just as it ended.
Yeah, so that's where I think we might go tomorrow, which, if we do, will be very interesting, because that will be the first real sort of blunder that Path West blunder that Mr. Jovich can specifically point to and ask a Path West witness, how could this have possibly happened?
Okay, well, we'll all pop our lab coats back on and head back into court tomorrow. Thank you both for your time today, and thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with Tim and Emily. Join us then for day 38 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.